everybody. Welcome back for another episode. Today we are here with Landen Matechuk. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And he is a GIS consultant. So I guess, Landen, I'll have you start off right there and introduce yourself and then tell us a little bit more about what a GIS consultant is.
Thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it.
Yes.
My name is Landen. I'm a GIS consultant living in Vancouver, BC. And I have my own company, and we work on taking GIS solutions, so that's different mapping software, data analysis methods, taking data and projecting it into maps, figures, graphs, and different types of mediums that are useful for scientific research, commercial uses, anything like that. Yeah.
Okay, and then just to start out even more basic than that, do you want to explain what GIS even means?
GIS means Geographic Information Systems. So this is used in almost any industry. It's anything that's taking data and analyzing it, putting it into different formats. This can be data collected by field scientists out collecting location data, or things like salmon stocks, animal stocks, things on forests, almost anything, and then bringing that to a platform, projecting it into a map. And by doing that, you're able to look more in depth at the data. You're able to map trends, map relationships, and put it in a form that makes it easier to communicate to wider populations, or maybe groups of people, groups of researchers that might not have specific expertise in the field that you're presenting. So it's just a really good technology, a really good set of methods to communicate important research and findings.
Amazing. And then, so you said you have your own consulting business. So how long have you been doing this? Like when did you get into this? What was your interest that actually got you into this?
So I studied at the University of Victoria. I started it in political science. And then I took some geography courses, which included introductory GIS course. And I really saw the application of GIS to communicate things in one discipline to a bunch of other disciplines. And I thought that was a really powerful application of it, sort of bringing together different groups that might not work together or understand each other's work. And that's when I sort of became focused on GIS specifically, finished my degree in that, and then I started my own company last year. So this is almost a year from when I started. Yeah.
Congratulations. Yeah. That's awesome. So was it always, when you first started to get intrigued by this specific field, was it primarily for any specific, I guess, like avenue? I mean, we'll get into this soon, but right now you're doing salmon stream mapping. So was it always with an interest in wildlife or like the outdoors, or was it just kind of applicable to so many different things that you thought it would just be really valuable no matter what? Or I guess, was there a thing that you envisioned that you would?
Yeah, I think a little bit of both. Lots of GIS and lots of geomatics work incorporates field work. So that is going out, collecting data, working with a bunch of different scientists, researchers, or out doing field work. So that was attractive, is that you can have sort of some office time to work on things, and then also go into the field and collect your own data, or work with a group that is collecting data. And then also, the application for climate change is something that was really focused on, especially at University of Victoria. They have a big geography department. All the professors have their hands in a lot of different climate change issues and disciplines, and working on solutions to find better ways to map and research that. I think that's something that's unique to University of Victoria. If I was studying somewhere else where maybe there's a different type of industry or another type of focus, I might have not gotten into focusing on climate change and environmental issues as much. So I I think that's a little bit of the way that sort of UVic shaped my career path.
What a cool opportunity to offer to people that, I mean, I I would be pressed, and maybe this is just because I didn't go into like a science-based field, but I can't imagine that even being something that was offered at my college, unless, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, people from SLU, but I feel like that wasn't really on the radar. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a really amazing and inspiring opportunity to give you all and just say, hey, this is a current
Mm-hmm.
situation, this is a current issue, and we're going to like stand behind that, and we need to pay attention. And this is a field and a device we could be using to really focus on this and see it progressing over time. It's incredible. And I wanted to ask too, like, what are the different things that you've
Mm-hmm.
mapped come like leading up to now? What
Mm-hmm.
are the different wildlife populations or different things that you've actually been working on?
So again, at University of Victoria, they exposed us to a wide variety of applications for GIS. So we were using crime data to map hotspots of bike theft. We were using fire smoke data to map where the fire smoke has a higher concentration in communities in Victoria. We did a lot of road mapping, just a wide variety of
Okay.
topics in school. And then I was offered to do a directed study for the city of Victoria. And this is sort of where my path became a little bit more focused into what I'm doing now. In Victoria, they have a water supply area that sort of houses the reservoir and
Okay.
collects the water to support and is the water that's used for all of Victoria. Um, in this area, they have 4 or 5 watersheds that they own, and they're only using 3 watersheds right now that are
Mhm.
contributing to the reservoir. With growing populations and changes in climate and uncertainty in climate, they're looking at expanding and opening the 4th watershed to sort of collect more water. But because of the wide variety of uses that happened in this watershed, logging, different types of things that went on there, they wanted to do some studies to get a better idea of what the watershed houses, so that when they open that up, it's not going to contaminate the water or cause any issues with the water. So I was brought in to do forestry mapping of this watershed, looking at biodiversity and looking at resilience, which is a big topic for ecosystems right now. If a disturbance happens, how is this ecosystem going to bounce back? How are the trees going to bounce back? How is the soil going to bounce back? If something like a disease comes in and there's a forest that is 90% one species of tree, and then the 10% is made up of the other species of the tree, we need to understand what the composition is, so that if that fungus comes in, now we have an area that has been deforested by one type of fungus. So looking at these types of issues, these types of solutions, and then that's sort of where I went into watershed mapping.
I actually wanted to backtrack because we were talking about the watersheds and if there's disturbances. So maybe a good place to actually start is explaining what a watershed is, and then
Mm-hmm.
also what different things could be considered disturbances. I know you mentioned, if a disease were to come in, but if there are other things that are considered disturbances, what could those look like?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I was brought in to work with the city of Victoria on mapping their water supply area, mapping their watersheds. And then this work continued on to doing similar watershed work with the Gulf Islands, which is a chain of islands which exists between Vancouver Island and the mainland. And then this continued into my work that I'm now doing up north in the Nechako watershed. So watershed is a area that is defined by a ridgeline or any type of geology, and it sort of the water falls and it goes into either basin, river, or streams. And then this is best described by a mountain. You have rain falling on a mountain. Some of the rain goes down one side into rivers and streams and channels and eventually reservoirs. And then on one side, it sort of makes its way through the ecosystem into the streams and channels and goes on the other side. So this is a really useful way of sort of separating ecosystems and managing them because of the interconnection between different features in the ecosystem in these areas. For instance, if there's a disturbance such as clear-cut logging or a forest fire up in the top part of the watershed, you would be able to measure and see this disturbance and see what happened downstream in the reservoir. So this interconnectivity sort of makes it easier and is a useful way to organize these systems for conservation and mapping and research.
Okay, amazing. And you said that you were able to do this off of like an island chain, like channels, and then up north now. So what were you mapping?
So when I first started mapping, it was all forest ecosystem. So we were looking at ways to measure resilience. So an ecosystem's resilience is its ability to bounce back and return to its steady state of productivity and existence after a disturbance or event. So this event could be something as the pine beetle, which was a big issue in northern British Columbia, a forest fire, maybe a severe drought, anything like this. If an ecosystem has levels of low resilience, then this event will affect it more than if the ecosystem has high resilience. So the challenging thing is how do you measure this? So we were looking at things, we developed methods to map this through things like species diversity, the amount of different species and the populations of the species. How many are there? How many of these species are a majority of the area? Is this one area dominated by one species? And if something like the pine beetle comes into this area, is it going to be detrimental to the ecosystem? Another way of mapping this in forest ecosystems is structural variability. So is there a variety in ages? Is there a variety in height? Is there a variety in forest composition? And the research shows that the more variety and diversity there is in the ecosystem, the more responses it has to these disturbances, the more resilience it has. So by being able to map this and research this and then communicate it in a way, you're able to measure a forest ecosystem's resilience. So I completed this work for the city of Victoria, working on their water supply area, and I carried this work over to the Gulf Islands.
So I'm curious if you've seen, especially with those kinds of mapping and kind of like being out in the field, even over the past 5 years, if you've noticed that there is a prevalency of like more beetles or more of a certain kind of invasive species or something happening that's correlated to global warming, because I don't know that many people realize that the glaciers melting and things like that are like these really big things that we hear about are like more wildfires, but there's actually these things happening that are more like insidious or like smaller things that are happening that also lean towards there being issues with climate change and stuff like that, primarily with these trees are dying and like more beetles come in or like things like that are killing off stuff that we need. So I'm curious if you've already started to see or have noticed trends like that, or if there are more issues with a certain species of something that are coming in that you didn't used to have a problem with.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a good point. A lot of times people focus on the big issue, and you hear about these climate summits and things happening far away from you. You're not seeing these issues in your community, in your space. So I think a good example of this is on on the Gulf Islands, they're very dependent on groundwater, rainwater, and reservoirs of this water that exist on the island only from rain. There's no, so a big thing there, sort of the work I was doing was all about these groundwater reserves and the relationship that they have with the forests and the vegetation. So if there's a Gulf island and they have these reservoirs of water, then you add more population, you add more development, you remove lots of the vegetation, you remove the forest ecosystems. We're starting to see a lot of water shortages on these islands for that reason. So previously, a developer would go in and they would drill some wells and find some water and say, this is a great place to put a development. And then they would remove the ecosystem that's there and the forest and everything, put some houses, and now this water is getting used and it's not getting recharged by the system that sort of created this reservoir before. So that's a big issue that's happening in BC with those Gulf Islands. So being able to map and research the vegetation and the reservoir and sort of figure out this relationship and how we can moderate and mitigate this issue is definitely something that's affecting the populations and the residents of these islands right now. And it's sort of a pressing issue that a lot of researchers are working on.
Yeah, and I think unless you're in one of those smaller communities where this is very prevalent, like in real time, you're not going to even hear about it or know that that's a thing. I mean, we're
Mm-hmm.
based in Phoenix, Arizona,
Mm-hmm.
and droughts and water shortages are a very real thing that we are
Yeah.
constantly having to consider. And we see Lake Mead and up in Page, we have other like water sources that are supposed to be taking care of many different places
Yeah.
that do not have enough water to do that. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's very eye-opening and
Yeah.
alarming and something that kind of demands that you pay attention to it. So I feel
Mm-hmm.
like with what you do, you have to be seeing a lot of these things up close and personal in many different capacities, and from
Mm-hmm.
water to wildlife to
Mm-hmm.
plants, just everything.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess now leading into what you're doing currently, are you primarily only salmon stream mapping now, or like are there other projects that you're also doing?
Mm-hmm. So I'm still working with the Islands Trust doing watershed mapping for them. And then this new project I'm working on is for the provincial government, and they're looking at the Nechako watershed, which is a northern watershed near Prince George. And this watershed has a great importance to wild salmon stocks and wild salmon spawning. And the issue that we are seeing there is that because of development and removal of vegetation along the stream banks, we're seeing a increased amount of erosion and deposition of sediment. So we're seeing that areas that were once suitable for salmon spawning, because of the removal of vegetation, increase of more sediment, they're no longer suitable. So what I've been mapping is these changes and looking at areas of importance and sort of how can we remediate this through the reintroduction of vegetation and things that would reduce sediment erosion.
So what kind of vegetation is being removed, and like what is causing the sediment to come in, and like how does that negatively impact salmon spawning?
The forest banks are usually held together by the roots of vegetation and trees and different types of things that exist on these banks. And once those are removed, they can be removed from agriculture. A lot of the areas close to these floodplains are high in nutrients, so they're really good for farming. So this has obviously been done in BC over the last 150 to 200 years. So we're seeing that these areas have a higher amount of erosion, because once you remove that stabilizer, you remove the ability for that sediment to sort of stay in that bank and become and be resistant to that erosion. So that's a big part of it. Another big part of it is the increase in flow and discharge. This is from increased precipitation. That's a big thing that's happening in BC right now. We've had a lot of devastating floods over the last week, and a lot of devastating floods, and also introduction of glacier melting, also snow melt. A lot of times the snow would melt a little bit slower, more gradual, but we're seeing, obviously with climate change, you're seeing increased severity of events and frequency. So you may have a lot of snow and then rapid melting. So these extremes are impacting all of the streams up there and affecting the salmon, because the salmon need really specific features of a stream to spawn and spawn successfully.
Okay, that's interesting because I feel like most people, the argument is, look, like we're getting so much more precipitation, we're getting more snow, like that's a good thing. But you're saying that the flooding and like a lot of precipitation at once, or like the speeding up of that process, is actually detrimental to the environments and ecosystems for like certain things.
Yeah, yeah. I think with climate change, it's not like a lot of times global warming is used, and then people say, "Oh, well, it was really cold yesterday, so how could this be happening?" But with climate change, it's the increase in severity of these events, and also the increase in frequency, right? So you're seeing things that may have been a 200-year flood happen a couple times in a 5-year period, and you're seeing unprecedented weather events like we had in BC with the flooding, and record-breaking temperatures on both ends of the spectrum: record-breaking cold, record-breaking hot. So that's the biggest issue is our infrastructure, our ecosystems, the animals are all trying to adapt to this, but because it's happening at such a fast rate, it's making it difficult.
Yes. Okay. So I feel like I have some bigger open-ended questions for you. You can
Yeah.
answer them however you would like.
Okay.
And you might not, they might be too big, which is fine. But I feel like within the work that you're doing, you're coming face to face with a lot of these bigger questions or concerns often. And
Hmm.
especially having some experience through college with professors and people that were kind of like pushing towards, we need to be paying attention to environmental crises or environmental issues and climate change and global warming, even through your studies. Like, what are the red flags you're seeing? Like, what are the trends or the things that you're seeing that are concerning to you whenever you're out, like dealing with wildlife, dealing with water, dealing with, land, and just, I don't know, just being out in the environment? Like, what are the things that you notice that are concerning to you as someone who's mapping this and seeing trends over time?
Hmm. I think when I'm brought in for specific issues that need to be studied and need to be communicated. So when I'm brought in, there's already an issue
Mm.
that I'm trying to mitigate. So just the fact that this type of work exists in this space is a red flag. Like I wouldn't need to be tracking the water usage and the forest ecosystem stuff on the islands if it wasn't a problem. Or I wouldn't be working up north on these salmon streams focusing on sediment erosion if that erosion wasn't happening.
Hmm.
Maybe I'd be on the opposite side studying the positive effects if things were differently. But right now, this type of work exists because of the changes that we're seeing on a provincial scale, but also in a smaller community setting. Just the things that are happening in BC, and like you were talking about the water situation there.
Hmm.
These problems are no longer things you just see on TV or big ideas that people are debating. These are issues that are forefront and affecting people every day.
Yeah. So would you say that your field is relatively new then? I guess I didn't really even think about that, that the kinds of projects that you're working on might not have been around maybe 10 years ago.
Hmm. I think people were studying climate change and these effects, but GIS as a discipline and the technology has just been increasing exponentially. It's the biggest increasing field for most industries and obviously scientific research. And we just weren't able to use technology in this way 10 years ago. This is because there's programs like Google Earth where you have access to a huge span of years and really high resolution satellite imagery that sort of enabled me to work on problems up north without having to be there. And things like that have just made it possible to do this type of work.
Okay. That's fascinating. I mean, obviously, I feel like even over the past, I mean, 2020 in general, I feel like people just had their eyes, peeled, I guess, for the first time. There were so many documentaries that came out, so many things that
Yeah.
really were pushing, like, hey, this is something we should be concerned about. And now you're stuck at home and you have to watch this documentary and think about it. You can't run away from it.
Yeah.
But the idea that this wasn't even really a relative or like needed space for GIS, like yes, it existed, but now it's being utilized in this like very specific way. And I find that very interesting that there is
Mm-hmm.
such a need and there's a growing need and people are investing in it, which is a positive.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm glad that different organizations and groups are finally taking care and taking concern. But then again, it's sad that we need it. um,
Mm-hmm.
so I guess this is another question from your viewpoint of like what could the everyday person be doing, or like is it really just this a bigger thing that we as an individual aren't able to really mitigate?
Mm-hmm. I think I think it's important to be aware of larger scale issues, be aware of what's going on everywhere else. But I think it's also important to be more focused on what's happening in your community and the small things that you can do as a consumer, as a community member, and as someone living where you are, because there's going to be unique challenges and unique solutions to wherever you're located. So whether that's being um, showing using lots of intent in what you're consuming, food wise, clothing wise, even information wise, and also just being a part of your community, listening to what types of things are happening. I know within the Chaco watershed, they have a community group where they discuss the health of the watershed, and I think that's a really useful way of looking at it because of sort of what we talked about before is that everything in that watershed is connected and feeds off of each other, and that's also true for the humans and the people that populate that area. So being aware of where you get your water, where you get your food, how that comes to you, and then make some changes or double down on things that you're already doing that are good. I think that's the best thing that people can do.
Company book club, and we just read this book that actually focused on the redwoods in California in the
Mm-hmm.
70s and the logging and the pesticides that were being sprayed in certain communities and like how that impacted. It's fictional, but based on real things that had happened, but how that water was like the only source of water for this small community, and then it was being like poisoned with pesticides, but nobody knew it, nobody thought about it, nobody realized. And I think what you were saying about paying attention to like what's happening right outside your door and like where your resources are coming from is so important because I'm in Phoenix. It's a large city, and I would be pressed to probably ask 10 people passing by where they get their water and they actually know where it's coming from.
Yeah.
I mean, I would hope I was wrong. Maybe they would prove me wrong, but um, I feel like most people we just consume it and don't really think twice about it. And
Mm-hmm.
unless it really is affecting you and impacting you, and like, unless we got an email tomorrow that said, you're done, you don't have any more water, like, sorry. Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and nothing came out. Yeah, I think that most people then would be very concerned, but until it like directly impacts you, there is
Yeah.
a feeling of like, well, that doesn't
Yeah.
pertain to me, so
Or
I
you
don't have
turned
to
your
worry
tap
about
on and
it.
nothing came
And I
out.
think that we
Yeah.
see that even with our mission, like, picking up litter outside and stuff like that. It's like, well, it's not my trash, so I'm not going to worry about it. And it's like, well, we all have to do our part though. And it does impact us all at
Hmm.
some point in time. This is going to come back around. Um, and I wonder
Yeah.
what more we could all be doing, or
Yeah.
if you have like certain recommendations of,
Yeah.
where do you get your information? Like, where do you go to get educated about things like this for like for an everyday person?
Yeah. We have a lot of information coming in, and I think podcasts are a great way of consuming that information. It's not a short, in your face way of getting your information. It's not built off of clickbait headlines. You can sit and listen to someone talk about what an issue that they're working on, or just even the act of going on a podcast platform or app, scrolling through, clicking on something, and spending an hour or even longer listening to something. Just that process alone is creating some criteria and sort of checks and balances already to filter the information and make sure that it's something worthwhile to you and something worthwhile that someone put together and spent however long researching it and an hour long talking about it versus just quickly writing up something online. So even if just including a environmental news
Yeah.
or learning about a researcher, just including one of those podcasts and maybe your week playlist, I think is a great way to learn about what's going on.
Do you have any podcast recommendations?
Podcast
Put you on the
recommendations.
spot.
Yeah, this one for sure when it comes out.
Thank you.
And then I listen a lot to Rich Roll.
Such a
He's
good one.
great. He has a lot of cool people on, and just the way he interviews people, it's very calm, and just the way he's so appreciative of his guests and their
Hmm.
time, and his curiosity. I think that's a really good podcast where you get a nice balance of what people are doing, small scale, just in their everyday diet and exercise, and then also larger scale. He brings in people. One of my favorite ones was the people who did Little Big Farm. I don't know if you've seen that
Yes.
documentary, but
Yes.
yeah. So had them on talking about their regenerative farm and their regenerative farming practices, and sort of the impact that has not only on the food but on the ecosystem and the environment and the people working there and the people involved with it, and then eventually the people consuming the food. It's just a nice sort of full circle story on people, environment, consumption, and how changes and actions can make a big difference.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect word for all of it too. It's just like our consumption of things, our consumption of the environment, our consumption of resources, our consumption of media, like everything should be done with intent, and with, with mindfulness of what that does. And there was this campaign that a brand that I really like did, where their focus is on water and accessibility to water. And so they ran this campaign where they challenged everybody to run to their water source. Oh no. Okay. Sorry, I just got a thing that said that my video was going out. I was like, oh no, it's me again. But they challenged every person to run to their water source and like run along it, and see how far away it is from where they live. And if I had done it in Phoenix, it was going to be like 30 plus miles just to get to one way to where our water comes from. So it was just really eye opening to like how much work we've put in to like bring that to us, and we don't think twice about it.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's a lot of levels to that. That's a really cool initiative. Yeah,
Yeah, and I was like, man, I didn't sign up to run an ultra today, but okay, like I guess
yeah,
I'm doing it. Um, but I feel like if we were challenged more to do those things, to, go out and physically do something that was more tangible.
Yeah.
Or, like we were challenged to every week just sit down and like learn something new on a podcast about something that we don't know about. We would all
Yeah.
be better for it.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of segues into my next question of like, how do we get people to care? Like, how do you get people to
Yeah.
care about what's happening to the water, what's happening to a salmon stream, what's happening to,
Hmm.
a beetle, like a tree that's getting invaded by a beetle? Like, how do you get people to
Hmm.
care about that instead of them just being like, oh,
Hmm.
whatever, like it's a beetle, who cares, you know?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that's one of the reasons I got into GIS is just the ability to take sort of abstract data and abstract figures and abstract topics, and then be able to put it into maps and a product that is easily consumed and understood by anyone who reads or uses it.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of where this field sticks out from the rest, is its ability to communicate things across disciplines and to a variety of different groups. So as a GIS consultant, it's sort of my job to take this data, whether if I'm collecting it or using it from another researcher, and then put it together in a way that is going to communicate what's going on, but also impact whoever is reading or using it, either in a research document or a lot of times I'm using interactive web maps or interactive stories that you can go on, you can click around, you can see what's going on, and this is just a really useful way of making people understand it, and then sort of creating that space for them to talk about it, learn it, and then make changes
Mm-hmm.
if they will. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like we're very visual creatures. Like obviously you can tell from the platforms that have been successful, even for social media and stuff, like they're very visible, photo driven. So the ability to show a map, to show something that says, hey, look at this trend, look at the impact this is having, I feel like that's so much more profound and like aesthetically moving than if we just sat here and said, like, oh, typically there's 1,000 salmon that spawn during this, time of the year, and there were only, 500. It's like it doesn't hit. It hits differently whenever you have to see it visually, versus just hearing it. So I feel like you're in a very moving field.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And like a cliche, like a picture is worth 1,000 words. Sometimes there's a whole 40-page, 50-page, 60-page research document that I can take the data from and sum it up into one interactive map or one interactive figure. So it's a big issue with academia is sort of the access to the research that is done, and that's spoken about a lot. So with these interactive and online maps, you don't need sort of a sign in or need a subscription or need to be a student. It can be summed up and it can be communicated in one frame, which is a really powerful tool.
Yeah. And I feel like that's a whole nother conversation too, at making things accessible, like
Hmm.
allowing people to have access to these kinds of tools and this kind of data,
Hmm.
that potentially may not if they had to pay for a subscription or something like that. Like knowledge is
Hmm.
power. And if you're able to consume that and then have that, I think that we would all benefit from it.
Hmm.
So that's
Hmm.
a really cool aspect of what you do that you can offer to like more people that may not be able to do that. Even Google
Hmm.
Scholar and stuff, sometimes you have to pay for things and it's like, well,
Yeah,
I'm not going to drop, $30 on this
yeah,
scholarly paper. So I guess I'm going to go try to find it somewhere else. So
yeah.
that has to be a really big benefit too, of being able to offer and provide things that may
Hmm.
not be accessible otherwise.
Hmm. And the software itself, there's a lot of open source software, and it's getting easier and easier to use, which is amazing because if we were bringing it all the way back in history, whoever had the maps and had the knowledge of the area had the power, and all the kingdoms had their own cartographers, and you read a map, and that's how the world was, right? So now that we're entering this space where anyone can go on to Google Earth or use some of these open source GIS platforms and open data, anyone can sort of contribute and research and sort of understand their area, other areas, and it's sort of it's bringing that whole other aspect to understanding their science in space.
That's amazing. Yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
feel like you're in a very up and coming field still, even though it's been around for a while. But I guess in the space that we're in and what we're talking about, it's going to become more and more prevalent and more important. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I have a couple wrap up questions for you.
Mm-hmm.
One that comes to mind is there a specific, I guess, concern or topic that you would encourage people to learn more about just from your experience out in the field and like with what you do?
Mm-hmm. I think something that is super useful to know and understand is just the climate normals maybe in your area,
Mm.
because that's something that you're feeling every day, you're living in every day, and you can sort of see that difference. So if that data is wildly available, if you can go online and just see what types of trends, the changes in climate, and sort of what you're experiencing day to day. That's a way someone can sort of understand the changes in how they're going to affect them and their community.
It's great advice. I love that. I'm like thinking about here, and I'm like, well, every day is way too hot, and every
Yeah,
day, like my seatbelt burns me
yeah,
every time I get in my car. So,
yeah.
um,
Totally, yeah.
and then my next question for you is, what does keeping nature wild mean to you?
Hmm. Keeping nature wild means to me is when you're out experiencing nature and taking part in activities that are only made possible through conservation and protection. Definitely respect that. Leave the space you're in the same as if you came in, or better, picking up trash on your way. But sort of get into the history of where you're doing your activities, or where you're spending your time. I know even in BC, I was doing some trail running with a friend, and he was under the understanding that the whole forest we were running through, the forest that he regularly runs through, has never been logged, and it was all old growth. But between the trees, you can sort of see stumps that existed in the actual old growth, and that the area we were running through is actually second growth, or even sometimes third growth. So being aware of the history of where you are, and sort of contribute in keeping it a natural wild place.
I love that. And my last one for you is, where can people find you if you have like education that you're putting out through social media or on a website? Where can people find you?
So I have a personal LinkedIn, just Landen Matechuk, and then my company's LinkedIn, Cedar Shore Consulting. On those two pages, I post updates of the projects that I'm working on, interesting findings, some videos of tools or mapping applications that I've built, and sort of the how these can be applied to issues. And then I also have a blog post on my website, which is just cedarshoreconsulting.com.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you for dealing with
Yeah,
some technical difficulties and
yeah, no
giving some
worries.
time to us to shed light on an interesting area of science and mapping and data that I didn't know that much about. So, this is really
Yeah,
great to learn more and share this out. And hopefully, we'll have you back at some point and we can talk about positive things,
yeah,
positive changes. But thank you so much.
yeah. Of course. Thank you very much for having me, and the conversation. It was great.
Absolutely. My pleasure.